Hey kids, History Channel guy here. For my past two In Defense of videos, I have primarily defended historical figures such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. But this week I've decided to take a different approach and take on a more modern day historical figure. In today's In Defense of video, I'm going to be defending Richard Nixon. Oh boy. Before starting though, I understand Nixon can be a pretty controversial figure for many of us, and many of my viewers might actually have been alive when Nixon was president. So instead of dissecting each individual issue like I usually do, I'm going to say all of the bad things Nixon did followed by all the good things just to try to make it more simplistic. And I'll let you decide whether or not Nixon is worth defending. If you want to hear about all the good stuff about Nixon, you can skip to part 2, which I'll put a timestamp in the description about. But here we go, y'all. Remember to like and subscribe. Part 1. Why Nixon sucks. Okay, well, let's just get out of the gate and talk about Watergate. See what I did there? That was pretty punny. Okay, dad jokes aside, Watergate is probably the biggest scandal in American history. For those who don't know, the Watergate Scandal occurred during the presidential election of 1972, when 5 burglars were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The burglars were tasked with finding information to surveil the office of President Nixon's opponent, George McGovern. Of the burglars, 4 of the 5 of them previously worked for the CIA in the investigations against Fidel Castro. However, the main concern came from a man named James McCord, who was the security chief of the Committee to Re-elect the President. The committee was run by Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, which implicated him in the scandal. At first, President Nixon's team did an excellent job of shielding Nixon from the scandal, with Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, even saying that they had no comment on the, quote, third-rate burglary. Simultaneously, conspirators were deleting evidence as fast as they could, with the deputy director of the committee to re-elect the president even burning transcripts of wiretaps. On June 23, 1972, President Nixon, through third parties, ordered the FBI to tamp down the investigation. Though this initially worked, this plot was eventually revealed through Nixon's tapes, which was the secret recordings of his phone calls and conversations in the Oval Office. These tapes later became the stem of Nixon's downfall. Still though, most of this came after 1972, which was obviously an election year. In fact, Nixon and his cronies did an excellent job of threatening media members about implicating the White House in the scandal. For instance, shortly before the election, CBS News prepared a lengthy 2-part television report which would have tied Nixon directly to the Watergate scandal. After the first part aired, one of Nixon's aides called the president of CBS and threatened him if the second part of the special was aired. After that, no coverage of Watergate came from CBS, and other major news networks were also hesitant to put anything on the air. Simultaneously, most newspapers were sympathetic to Nixon, with multiple polls even showing that Nixon was more trustworthy than McGovern, which is insane. In the end, Nixon won every state except for Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., which gets 3 electoral votes for different reasons. It was a historical landslide. I guess you don't have to cheat after all, Nixon? But I digress. The Watergate trial was ugly to say the least. All 5 burglars pled guilty, and the cases implicated notable Nixon allies such as H.R. Haldeman, John D. I'm going to butcher this, Ehrlichman, and John W. Dean, all of which tried to cover up the scandal. Soon after, all 3 men, plus Nixon's Attorney General, Richard G. Clendenst, resigned. Later, Nixon's replacement Attorney General resigned because Nixon attempted to not release incriminating tapes. Luckily, after mass protests and public outcry, Nixon reluctantly released the tapes, which implicated him in a cover-up of the Watergate burglary. Though Nixon continued to decline that he had anything to do with the burglary, he resigned in August of 1974, and Vice President Ford took the office of the president and pardoned Nixon a month later. So, the corruption went full circle. Here's a fun fact off topic from Nixon. President Ford is the only president in United States history not to get elected, as Nixon's former Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in a separate scandal. This makes Ford the only president in United States history not to be elected by the Electoral College as either president or vice president. Just thought y'all might want to know that. Okay, back to Nixon. So, obviously the Watergate scandal isn't great, but is that the only major flaw with Nixon's presidency? Well, unfortunately for Nixon, he had a lot of other shady stuff. For instance, Nixon might have actually committed treason in a separate scandal involving the Johnson administration. During the 1968 presidential campaign, Nixon sabotaged peace talks with the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. The way he did this was by telling the South Vietnamese government that they would get a better deal when he becomes president. And therefore, they just needed to wait for him to be elected. Obviously, the South Vietnamese agreed to Nixon's deal and ended peace talks with North Vietnam. So, did Nixon keep his end of the bargain when he got elected? Of course he didn't. It's Nixon. Nixon did not resume orchestrating peace talks, and the Vietnam War would go on for another 4 years. What sucks is I didn't know about this before doing research, and I was going to put Nixon ending the Vietnam War as one of his good things. But when I found out about the scandal, I had to take it back. So, sorry Nixon lovers. Thousands of American service members would die in those 4 years. So, good job Nixon. Their names are on the wall in DC. That's on your hands. Okay, so is that it? Well, nope again. When doing my research, I found out that Nixon is actually responsible for my family moving to the United States. I'll explain. In 1972, Nixon okayed a CIA-backed military coup to overthrow the socialist democratically elected government of Chile, to install an American-backed dictator named Augusto Pinochet. At the time, my grandfather, Emilio, was a government official for the socialist Chilean government. So my whole family, including my mom, who was 3 years old at the time, had to escape the country or they would be executed by Pinochet and his cronies. On one hand, this angers me so much because my family literally had their lives threatened because of this ridiculous coup. But I'm proud to be an American and I wouldn't be here today without Nixon's coup. So, I don't know. I really don't know what to feel about this. Either way, my family was lucky. Thousands were killed under Pinochet's brutal regime. So, this is one I'm completely biased towards. And I do have to admit that sanctioning the overthrow of a democratically elected left-leaning government is not unique to Nixon, as throughout the Cold War, basically every United States president sanctioned something like that. It just so happens that Nixon sanctioned the one that involves me the most. One action, though, I cannot defend is Nixon's actions in Cambodia. Nixon is responsible for illegally bombing Cambodia, which is estimated to murder 100,000 Cambodians, some of which were military members helping the Viet Cong, but the vast majority were not. Many historians argue that these bombings led to the conditions where the Khmer Rouge gained power, which obviously led to the Cambodian genocide. The Cambodian genocide is estimated to kill 1.5 to 2 million people. But we also have to remember that Nixon was not the only one who created tensions in Cambodia, and maybe it's unfair to give him that complete criticism, because I don't want to be the one saying that Nixon created the Khmer Rouge. That just seems ridiculous. Nixon also ignored Pakistan's actions in Bangladesh by shielding the nation's military leaders, but I can't really blame him as much for the actions in Pakistan, considering Nixon's administration decided to take a non-interventionist approach to the conflict, which I'm usually for. Anyway, this is a lot, but does Nixon at least have some redeeming qualities? Well, yes, he actually does. Actually, kind of a lot of them. And I'll go over them now. Part 2. Nixon did some really good stuff. Okay, so you clearly see my feelings on Nixon are biased, mostly because of the direct impact he had on my family. However, the biggest part about being a good historian is being fair to all historical figures, despite your personal relations to them, and any preconceived biases of them. I'm looking at you, anyone who commented in my Jefferson video. That aside, Nixon actually accomplished a lot when he was president. The first notable thing that most Nixon supporters bring up is how Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA. Though I do want to acknowledge that in his second term, Nixon felt that the EPA had gained too much power. Some reports suggested he even attempted to get rid of it in his second term. Yikes. But he created it nonetheless. Even if these reports are true, the Nixon administration still created the EPA, which has done wonders in creating environmental protection across the United States. The most notable of which was patching up the ozone hole. Wait, you don't remember the ozone hole? Sorry, I forgot that you're only 13. I'll explain now. When your parents were in high school, the major concern wasn't climate change or global warming, and instead, it was destroying the ozone. What is the ozone layer? Well, it is the upper atmosphere that protects us from the sun's ultraviolet radiation, which would literally deteriorate us. Obviously, you don't want this to happen, and the concerns only rose when in 1985, British scientists announced that an expanding hole had formed in the ozone layer over Antarctica. After the Clean Air Act was passed by Congress, the EPA was instrumental in the regulation of and banning of CFCs, and they were given the authority to protect the ozone. Today, the ozone crisis seems like a distant memory, and frankly, this stems from Nixon creating the EPA. I think the Clean Air Act is pretty cool, but what else did Nixon accomplish? As it turns out, he still accomplished a lot. For instance, Nixon is responsible for opening relations with the People's Republic of China. Prior to Nixon opening relations, China had an extremely isolationist government, to Western nations especially. For 25 years, the United States and China had no diplomatic relations, and with Nixon's 7-day visit to China, diplomatic ties were finally established. For many Americans, this was the first time they viewed images of China. Nixon was able to meet with Communist Party leadership, including the Chinese Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong. Simultaneously, First Lady Pat Nixon was touring Chinese schools, factories, businesses, and it made for some excellent television. After his visit, Nixon declared his trip the week that changed the world, and certainly it did. China is responsible for many of the products that we see in the United States today, and Nixon opening up relations with China shifted the balance of the Cold War, as it drove a huge wedge between the Soviet Union and China. I'm going to give a little history about that, though. I do want to state that Chinese communism has always been at odds with Soviet communism, and the best way to show that is how China handled Emperor Puyi and how Russia handled Tsar Nicholas II. As many of you know, during the Russian Civil War, Nicholas and the whole Romanov family were murdered by Lenin's government. The act shocked the world and showed the cruelty behind the Soviet regime. The Chinese Communist Party wanted to take a different approach after their civil war to handle their former leader. Instead of executing Emperor Puyi, the party indoctrinated him and made him a full-blown communist. In fact, Emperor Puyi will live his life as a simple gardener. Anyway, sorry for that. Back to Nixon. I think Emperor Puyi is a fascinating character, though. Like, that guy it's very interesting, the stuff he went through. So, I might do a video on him. Off topic. Nixon had some other cool accomplishments, such as negotiating the strategic arms limitation treaties with the Soviet Union. According to the SALT treaties, the goal was to lower the manufacturing of missiles which were capable of holding nuclear weapons. Within SALT I and SALT II, the arms race was starting to end between the Soviet Union and the United States. So, Nixon, in a weird way, helped stop a nuclear war. That's pretty dope. Though I do have to acknowledge the negotiations for SALT I started under the Johnson administration. Nixon seriously got things kicking into gear, though. Now, we all remember JFK making the bold statement, by the end of the decade, the United States will put a man on the moon. But what if I were to tell you that it was under Nixon's presidency that Apollo 11 first landed a man on the moon? Moreover, as president, Nixon created the first federal affirmative action program, which opened the doors for thousands of minorities to be hired in federal positions. Prior to the Nixon administration, there was a lot of racism when it went to hiring minorities, but Nixon made it a federal policy to start hiring them. Though it is true Nixon used the Southern strategy, which some of you might have some problems with, I personally don't, but that's just my opinion. I think applying these affirmative action programs was a great step. Nixon used the historical knowledge of local governments using these practices, and he implemented it into the federal government. So, you see diversity in the federal government today. It's because of Nixon. The last tremendous accomplishment I want to highlight about the Nixon administration is his strides he made for healthcare, primarily with kidney patients. It's obvious that the United States doesn't have universal healthcare, but for kidney patients, they do. Prior to the Nixon administration, kidney dialysis machines were so rare that many hospitals had literal death panels to decide which patients would receive treatment and which ones would die. Those committees would be ripe with corruption, with patients often having to bribe members to ensure they lived. Some of these bribes came up to $30,000 a year. In 1972, that all changed when Nixon signed a bill which stated that the government would pay for dialysis for anyone who needed it, officially ending the death panels and the corruption. Everyone in America with kidney failure would get the proper medical treatment they needed. So, Nixon has saved the lives of thousands of Americans, and frankly, most people don't even know about it. So in conclusion, was Nixon a bad president? Well, it really depends on which way you look at it. On one hand, Nixon was incredibly corrupt and acted as no man should act, nevertheless a president. But also, during his presidency, Nixon had some major accomplishments. He overall ran an efficient country with a thriving economy. I frankly believe that Nixon was just paranoid. If you read stories about him, even when running against JFK, he was just a very awkward man. One story is pretty hilarious, and I really want to tell you. So, Nixon was literally refusing to talk to reporters for like a week on the campaign trail. But one night, he finally agreed to do an interview. So, obviously, all these reporters want to talk to the Republican Party candidate. And he tells them to meet them at the pool. It's pitch black outside, it's the middle of the night. Nixon arrives in a skimpy bathing suit and jumps in the pool, starts swimming around, and then jumps out and barely gives him a word. Nixon's just a weirdo, guys. The weirdness probably just led to his paranoia, which ultimately led to Nixon's resignation. Ford also did not do any favors by pardoning Nixon, which only builds on the corruption narrative. But one also needs to look at the Carter administration to see that Nixon was a pretty good president when it came to economics. If Watergate never happened, I honestly think Nixon would be considered one of the greatest presidents of the 20th century, and modern Republicans would not be embarrassed for admitting that they like him. It's sort of like a taboo thing now. It's like the only Republican president in the 20th century was Reagan. No one else wants to admit, I voted for Ford, I voted for Nixon, or I voted for Bush Sr. Anyway, Nixon was a mediocre president. You should just consider him a middle-of-the-road president who got sidetracked due to Watergate and paranoia. But that's just my opinion. But what do y'all think? Do you think Nixon has been unfairly treated by historians? Or was he just plain old a bad president? Let me know what you think in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe if you want more In Defense of videos. I think my next In Defense of will be In Defense of Lincoln. I've been trying to put this one off, but I've been reading that a bunch of schools are going to rename their high schools and middle schools to get rid of Lincoln's name, which is just the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So he can't be canceled, and I need to defend him. Thanks, guys. Let me know if you know any historical figures you want me to do next.